Good afternoon, everyone, or perhaps good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us for the Oxford Internet Institute's Digital Ethnography session, featuring Giuseppe Alessandro Veltri, Professor of Research Methodology and Cognitive Sociology at the Department of Sociology and Social Research at the University of Trento. A little housekeeping. We are very fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request that the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. You can pose any question using the Q&A tab at any time, and these will be answered at the end of the talk. But please keep questions as concise as possible. They will be visible to all attendees and can be upvoted, and we will endeavour to follow up on any unanswered queries after the session. Please allow me to introduce David from the OxDEG team.
Hello. I'm very happy to introduce Professor Giuseppe Veltri today. He's a cognitive psychologist and a sociologist, and actually just last month in October he was the co-author of a paper in Nature about research integrity, which is something I wasn't actually aware he was working on, and it's quite close to some of my interests. And it has the wonderful title of 9 Ways to Move from Talk to Walk, which we might want to explore in the questions. He's got a recent book with Polity Press on digital social research, which I think is what he's going to be partly talking about. And also another book that he's currently working on is about designing online experiments for the social sciences, and that I think is of great interest to many of the people who are in this seminar. So with no more ado, I will pass the baton to him. Giuseppe.
Thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here in this webinar. I'm very happy to have this talk about digital research, because it gives me the opportunity to kind of self-reflect after a few months that I've been working on my book and other, let's say, related writings that I've been working on. I've prepared a few slides which I'm going to share, just to, I suppose nobody can escape the slide usage. And just a second, I will be sharing them and putting them in full screen, and hopefully you can see them. So when I was contacted by David, we had this sort of email exchange about this issue of having standards in a way, or discussing what's going on in digital social research. And in a way, this kind of starting point that I had came from really teaching methods for a few years. Personally, I'm a psychologist by background, social psychologist from LAC, but I've been really interested in methodology for a while. And I am, I suppose, part of that generation that really experienced the transition between, if you want, the pre-digital and the digital way of doing research. So I've experienced, first of all, in my own research, this transition, but then I also saw how the way how you would teach methods has changed in the past few years. So roughly about 5 years ago, I was tasked to teach digital methods at University of Leicester, where I was working at that time, and also in other places, including LAC. And one of the challenges was, I suppose, a common challenge for many who taught methods, was that I was teaching master students, and their background was very diverse. And so you could not really assume that they would have the same level of methods training and the same type of methods training. While at the same time, while I was teaching digital methods, I wanted to stress really the sort of similarity and differences between what was new, what was in a way the innovation we were experiencing, and what was to a certain degree, still open to discussion, open to debate. So in preparing the teaching material and reflecting about these issues, it became evident to me that there is a debate, of course, about digital methods, and we will see some of the points. I mean, I suppose there are, we can characterize two positions, or at least for the sake of discussion at the end of this talk. But overall, I have to say, what I found was a great degree, a great deal of books which were about technical stuff. I mean, technical, what I mean is techniques, for example, about text mining or about web scraping applied to social sciences. And of course, then other type of techniques that now have become more common. But you would struggle to find a book that, at least that was my experience. Now things have changed a bit because other books came out, of course, discussing the sort of, in the framework of research methodology of the social sciences, the issue of digital research. And of course, I mean, that's my take. I mean, that's what I sort of, I thought was interesting to discuss, but there are many issues that I couldn't really cover in this book. What I found was that there really, I came to realize there were really sort of 3 points, at least 3 points that were worth exploring more. The first one was, and this is, I think, still an ongoing debate, due to the traditional data scarcity that we had in the social sciences, the enthusiasm about the possibility of data collection given by sort of digital domain really led us to focus about data collection issues. It came much later, a sort of critical reflection about how we would analyze this data, and also about, let's say, methodological aspects in the moment in which we were collecting those data. Of course, I mean, all researchers are concerned about data quality, and it doesn't mean that we were not concerned about quality, but a sort of broader reflection about what we were doing, how the practices and some of the sort of almost epistemological guidelines we were using started to be difficult to adapt in the context of the digital data, digital research. And so there was an emphasis on data collection, but much less on sort of methodological aspects concerning how this data collection really worked. And I would also add less concern about the analytical strategies that we had to employ. Then, of course, after a few years that digital methods become more and more available, sort of the rise of let's say, statistical learning techniques, machine learning and so on, started to sort of become a hot topic, and people started to discuss, you know, machine learning in the social science and how you can use that and that sort of stuff. But that's, I mean, that's not what I'm going to talk about it today. Perhaps we can just marginally touch these issues in the questions. The other issue was, well, of course, this is a concern that comes from the background I have. So I come from social psychology, in part. Then I moved to also to do sociological research. Great deal of concern was always about measurement issues. The reason being that we deal with sort of very abstract concept we want to measure. And as soon as we move into the abstract concept type of issues, the measurements issues started to be extremely important. So in my training and in the training I provided, I always sort of dedicated a lot of time to assess issues like validity, construct validity, and this is one of the issues I'm going to discuss today. The other point is that there is this debate, we will see that at the end, but for some, there is this transition between, if you want, traditional methods into the digital. So we see the example of, what surveys were before the digital and now online web surveys, what they are. And how they've changed. They changed in a number of ways. And the same goes for other data collection techniques, like in interviews or focus groups and so on. So we have this sort of digitalized methods. So methods that existed before, and we had some guidelines about, some ideas about how these methods need to be used in order to function properly, so to speak. And their digitalized version is an attempt to sort of update, if you want, these sort of practices and guidelines. But then there are a group of people, some also good friends and colleagues. They work in especially in the Netherlands, I have to say, that they are much more for a sort of an approach that sees more a breaking point in terms of what the digital brings to the table of social sciences. So the idea here is that, okay, sure, we can use the traditional methods, but actually what we are really waiting for are native digital methods. So methods that they don't really have the sort of an equivalent in the non-digital context. And this is a debate in the sense that there are people that they're skeptical about this sort of natives approach and so on, but we will see about that. Now, when I found myself in teaching methods and in particular digital methods, one of the critical points that you always have to make is the sort of different nature of the data that we're dealing with. Now, a few years ago, I believe, 4 or 5 years ago, a chap from the US Statistical Office made, I think, this nice distinction, which again, for the sake of discussion, between design data and organic data. And the idea here is that design data are data that basically they do not exist until they are collected by the instruments that we produce. So design data, in a way, is all we traditionally have done in the social sciences. Survey data, they come to exist when we create a survey and a questionnaire and all the sort of craft that goes into doing that. And the same applies to experiments and questionnaire and so on. But organic data are, in a way, goes into this idea that data are being collected anyway, independently of the researcher willingness to collect some data, because that's what we do. Our society now collect digital traces pretty much about everything. And so these organic data are natural in the sense that they exist in the environment beyond the necessity of the researcher. So what we're doing is, in fact, repurposing these data for research. Okay. Now, this is not a new situation in which researchers, social scientists have found themselves. For those of you who have done that, secondary data analysis always, has been part of the tradition for a long time. So the idea that you take data collected by someone else, and then you sort of reuse those data in a novel way. But in this case, we are repurposing data that often they are not, or they were not designed for research, and they are coming from very different sources. So there are similarities with the issue of secondary data analysis, but it's not exactly the same situation. So repurposing data, it's an interesting point because it kind of reverse the sort of traditional way how we look at the construction of data. Now, we have to remember that in secondary data analysis, of course, we had different level of quality of data existing, but things got standardized a lot. And the typical secondary data sets that we use in the social sciences come from very standardized and very, let's say, scrutinized sources. And often they are harmonized by institutions. Think about the big data sets from OECD or the UN, or you name it, of course, government and ministers and so on. But in this case, we have usually data coming from private companies, from actors in the case of digital data. They can use different standards, they have different reasons to collect certain things rather than others. They basically, there is a sort of wide range of practices, standards, and so on. And in fact, there are people that are studying this. They're studying the sort of the data curation that different, say, sectors do, because finance is not the same of health, and health is not the same of whichever other context, online gaming, for example. So we found ourselves in this repurposing, and as I said, the repurposing creates this situation that makes a bit peculiar for the researcher, particularly researchers that they are, and I suppose the disclaimer here is that I make these claims in the context of essentially a quantitative type of approach of research, because of the sort of linear way of developing the construction of the measurements that we are going to use. But my guess is, and perhaps that we can explore that later, that is some of these issues are applicable also independently of the fact that this is particularly important for in the context of quantitative research. So I was saying that this repurposing creates a reverse of the normal process of development of measurement in social research. So normally what you would have is the case of A. So we have a concept that can be abstract or concrete. In the social sciences, in most cases, the concepts we are interested are sort of abstract. Think about, I don't know, political participation, or let's say social capital, or whatever concept. They need to be translated in let's say indicators that they measure properties from, and the fact that we can then devise variables that they are linked to this initial concept. And that's the case of the traditional way of doing research, where the move from the concept to the measurement allows different steps in which then we can, as I mentioned you before, we can deal with the construct validity in a sort of fairly structured way these days. So construct validity really means here that what we end up measuring, the variable, has as much as possible connection with the concept that we wanted to measure. Okay. So that there is a tight relationship between our measure and the concept we want to measure. Now, what I found is that in the context of digital research, you find yourself in a very different position. You find yourself in having variables collected by somebody else, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, and you try to sort of bring together these variables into a property that then can be linked to an indicator and then leads to a concept. So essentially is the reverse process of what I was saying before. And the sort of difficult part here is that this passage between variable properties and indicator is quite difficult. It's quite difficult because of a number of reasons that we will see in a second. But the crucial one, I think, is the fact that in the case A, when we choose indicator, we try to explore different angles, different sort of sub-aspects of the same concept. So essentially what we try to do is to sort of have a sort of mapping of the fact that the concept that we have in mind, we know cannot be measured only by one indicator or just two. So there is this well-known aspect in let's say, in measurement theory, that the fact that any concept cannot be sort of semantically exhausted by just a few indicators. Okay. But the choice of the indicators is usually guided by our theoretical understanding of the concept, because what we can do is saying, okay, this concept has these two different dimensions, and then we can tackle indicators based on those dimensions. For example, if we want to study, let's say, well, people's well-being, okay, we can say, well, people's well-being depends on, let's say, some kind of sub areas like health, but also their socioeconomic status. And so, having identified these sub areas of our well-being concept, we can then develop indicators for health, indicator for socioeconomic status. But if we found ourselves in a situation where the variables are already given, we don't choose the dimension that potentially we can use to so in this case, in the case B, we found ourselves that the variables are given. And so we have somehow to match these variables to a property and then choose an indicator based on what is available. So we are measuring something that perhaps covers only one sort of subdomain of the concept we want to explore. This is a typical critique that is done, for example, when people try to measure political participation online, where political participation is clearly a multidimensional concept because there are different forms of participation. It can be explicit participation or implicit. So you actively engage in political discussion and so on, or you do things that are still political, but they are not so explicit. But if all your variables are, let's say, geared towards, let's say, the explicit form of political participation, you just don't measure the implicit. And what happens is that what you call political participation is just, let's say, sort of, I was going to use bias, but bias is not the right word. Let's say sort of encouraged, sort of very, very lean way of using that concept. So the issue of construct validity for digital research becomes a problem. Becomes a problem because we found ourselves using what is available, and often what happens is that what is available becomes important just because it's available. And this is a typical problem for people that do research. But in the case of, I think, digital research, the example I've seen of a lot of research, I think, goes in that direction. So we have this issue of a complex way of dealing with construct validity. It does it does create problem also from a technical point of view. Now, what I said before, so far is really about sort of the conceptual level of the link between concept, indicators, variables, and so on. And so, in other words, it's also the fact that there is an ambiguity about the independent variable, so that we use online because we use what we get, so to speak, and not having any choice about it, we often force a link between some independent variables we just found to be available and some concept. And I think this is often the case. The example that comes to my mind is often a debate about the use of tweets. Okay, so often a tweet is there is the assumption that is equated as an opinion. So someone tweets something, and the idea is that whatever this person tweets is like an opinion given with any other methods, like in an interview or in a survey. And then the question is that the case? Is we can use the tweet as an opinion, and so we have this situation where the construct validity of many of the measures that we used from the digital context is it's very difficult to assess. And we will see in a few minutes that the traditional strategy to assess construct validity, they don't work very well with digital data. So we really don't have a strategy to assess construct validity. And I suppose at the very end, we pose the question, but maybe should we worry about construct validity or not? Now, this is a sort of more technical excursus, but in fact, in psychology or let's say sociology that is oriented with attitudes, opinion, and so on, there is a kind of statistical way of assessing construct validity. And usually that refers to two really way of doing it. One is using confirmatory factor analysis, and the other one is basically using something called the multi-trait multi-method matrix, MTMM. Now, these are techniques, we will see them in a second, that actually don't, they work well until we had, let's say, all, let's say, traditional data, but in the context of digital data, they don't work very well at all. And so we found ourselves in a situation where we either we have to develop new ways of doing it, or just we cannot use the sort of old guidelines we were using. So, for example, in the case of the multi-trait multi-method matrix, this is a sort of historical way of measuring construct validity. But essentially, the idea here is that we have the same construct, so the same concept, if you want, measure using different methods. And what we want to show is that these measurement done with different methods of the same construct correlates better than other measure of different constructs with the same method, and also with the different. This is the issue of called convergent and divergent validity. The problem here is that was doable when we were measuring and collecting data more or less in the same way. What I mean here is that the sort of type of data, the sort of nature of the variance of the data was similar. But that's not the case with digital data, and we will see in a second why that's the case. In the case of confirmatory factor analysis, what the issue here is that normally, in order to assess the construct validity, what you would do is compare your measurement, your new measurement, with a known way of measuring that construct. Okay, and we could use that. We can perform that when we had at least 3 indicators for each construct. And that's not the case again for digital data, because that's the case, that's the situation that was mentioned before. We basically found the indicators already available, so we cannot choose. So the problem here is that sometimes to have three different indicators about the same construct with digital data is difficult, because for a number of reasons, sometimes for just to be parsimonious, engineers in whatever platform we are using, they use one or two, or often one, and so we cannot use this sort of technique. But in addition, even when we have sufficient number of indicators, we have a problem, because often the way our data are collected in sort of digital context have very different frequencies. So they sort of collected a sort of different pace in time, and that creates a lot of problems. So similar with the problems with confirmatory factor analysis, in the case of MTMM, you get this problem that if we compare different methods, meaning if we, in order to do construct validity, we compare digital collected data and non-digital collected data, we have the problem that they really have different frequencies, they have different way of how they measure, so there's a massive variance in the way how they are collected. And that makes this sort of convergent validity based on correlation very difficult to achieve. So we found ourselves in a situation where all these sort of traditional way of assessing construct validity are simply not easy to just transpose at the context of digital data. And the question is, what comes next? I mean, how we progress from that? If you look at the sort of the current situation, is that only a group of people are really concerned about this, and that's social scientists who want to explain things. Why I'm saying that? Because if you are in a data science program, if you are a data scientist, as soon as you have good predictive power by your models, you just don't care if if you have construct validity about your indicators and your measures, because you're just interested in the outcome. You don't really, you're not trying to develop a theory, you're not trying to develop a model that explains the phenomenon. You just want to have the capacity of predicting an outcome. And that makes sense. I mean, that's what the people are paid to do in companies. They want to predict, what makes an increase in sales, what makes people stay longer on a platform. They don't need a theory. I mean, they just don't need it for that. But as a social scientist, you are interested. Sure, prediction also it's interesting, and we'll say it's a useful result. But we are interested in explanation. And in order to have explanation, we need to be sure that what we are measuring is actually what we are measuring in terms of the concept and the theory we use to measure it. And so the issue of construct validity comes into play. When we don't have that, then we, without sort of being aware of it, we are moving ourselves in just the direction of the data scientist, in the sense that we are doing models that perhaps statistically perform well, but we don't explain much because we don't know what we're using. I mean, I found myself using in data that actually have designed to collect, some random forest models where, you get good statistical, so to speak, results in terms of prediction, but then there is no way you can interpret in a meaningful way what you get. Meaningful meaning theoretically from a point of view of, again, social sciences. So all these concerns that I mentioned so far are really concerns for social scientific research, and less, perhaps they're not simply a concern for those who are in the sort of prediction business, where they just don't care about finding explanations about whatever given phenomena we are investigating. And I mean, this is the sort of typical flow diagram about achieve construct validity. Now, what I find interesting here is that if you look at a lot of research published in the social sciences that has to do with digital data, I found very, I mean, and I can ascribe myself also in that. I mean, I'm not saying that to put the blame on someone, but you just don't do all this stuff. You just don't do it. You don't check for all these aspects of construct validity. So sometimes, you just ignore the issue. But then what happens is that you find literally hundreds of different ways of implementing the same concept using digital data, that they have a sort of marginal, if you want, way of explaining whatever phenomenon they're investigating. So perhaps one way of solving this issue would be to find a flow diagram like this one that applies in the context of digital, or simply to hope that people will use something similar to that. In fact, the sort of the free strategies that normally people use to assess validity, construct validity, are kind of difficult to achieve for different reasons. So the first one is the so-called structural signature approach. So the idea is you assess if structural features of online behavior, in this case, that's what I'm interested, online behavior, and so the idea is you assess if these structural features of online behavior are consistent in the context of non-online behavior. But that made sense when these two worlds were very much separated. Does it make sense when these boundaries between digital and non-digital are now very much blurred? I don't know. I don't think it does, to be honest, but I'll leave it open. The other strategy, which is perhaps the most common in those who do this type of research, and then perhaps I can give you some example how, at least myself, I've implemented in some studies, is to find a relationship with a known construct. So the idea is you sort of test whatever variables that you construct from online and web data kind of correlates well with a sort of accepted measure of the construct, measure that they are perhaps derived from the non-digital. So this is, for example, what I've tried to do in some cases where I had, for example, online experiments and lab experiments where we measure the same thing, we measure very similarly, and then same people, okay, do one and the other, and then I wanted to see how valid the measurement for the online was doing. And of course, the third is sort of influence between online and offline behavior, which is of course easier said than done. I mean, this is an old issue of finding the sort of balance between, finding the sort of causal relationship between the two, and then of course we enter the minefield of causality in social sciences. But even when, so I want to close now this issue of validity, because perhaps it's not the most exciting topic for most people, but I think it's a core issue where, in the book I spent a bit of time discussing it, and in fact it led me to think about what to do in my own research and how to explore these issues furthermore. But the broader topic of, do we need a canonized digital research? Meaning, do we need, in a way, sort of standards and sort of, or at least some kind of guidelines that still tell us, good from bad research in a way. And it reminds me of our old debate in qualitative research, where, how do you assess quality in qualitative research? There are also, I think, other points that are critical in the use of digital research. The other one, the one I wanted to talk about is briefly, is because I know time is running out, is representative and access. Now, one point I wanted to make here is very simple, is that as you probably all know, in the social sciences, we sort of developed the art of sampling because we couldn't access population, okay, except in very, very occasional context. Then the digital came, and so the enthusiast about accessing population, entire population, without the need of sampling and sampling strategy became the sort of produce an immense hope and joy in many researchers, including myself. But the reality is that as soon as then you move into the context of getting your hands on these data, you're actually dealing with quasi-population, because there is a lot of lack of transparent access to actually the data, because we know who collects the data. I mean, they're not usually publicly available. And the further complication is that when the notion of population in sampling strategy usually means a stable base population. Think about the typical example of sampling for a survey. You take a stable population like the tax records, and then that's your sampling frame, and then you build your sample. But that's not the case, because we have in many platforms we have unstable populations, plus the issue of the lack of full transparent access. I mean, there are some just part of this population you don't have access to. So that's a further issue that I think. So the question is okay, we move from sampling to population. What standards of quality or reliability about using population we have to develop in the context of digital research? And at the moment, we simply don't have it. We don't have it. I mean, I can give you some example. Now, again, I'm running out a bit of time. I think I have 5 minutes left. But so there is also another interesting point, I think, to make, is recently I've been doing quite a lot of online experiments for the European Commission and studies basically across different European countries and so on. And what I found is that you might be aware or not of the fact that survey methods has been in great difficulty in the past few years, simply because to build reliable samples has been very, very difficult because of a number of reasons: low response rate, the fact that they are very expensive and so on. So people moved to online surveys. Now, the main critique about online surveys was that the sample you would use in these online surveys, which are called online panels, were not representative of a general population, because initially many researchers used pre-recruited online panels, essentially of internet users, so people that had access to the online. Now that has changed. The sort of industry has changed about that. And what we have is some sort of clever way of building pre-recruited online panels from the general population, where essentially they build the panel as they would build it, a normal sample, a sort of traditional sample, where if people don't have access to internet, is given to them access. So they essentially, you make it possible to everybody to have the same chance to end up in the sample, so in these online panels. But there is a but. When you use these pre-recruited online panels of the general population, you have an issue with response rate again. Now, traditionally, the response rate was, the main issue of response rate was the response to to the invitation to your own survey, okay? Because that creates problem with your sampling and so on. In addition to that, now you have the response rate issue at the recruitment stage in the online panel. And interestingly enough, that's a crucial point because that affects the way how the online panel is representative of the general population, okay? The interesting point is that it doesn't matter who you contact in the business of online panels, they don't let you have this information. You just, they won't give you. They won't give you this information because that would affect, well, that would be an indicator of the quality of the online panel that they are selling to researchers. So they just don't, you just don't know. And that's a crucial thing because, well, in my case, when I do online panels in 20 countries in Europe, I need to be sure that each online panel in each country is representative of the general population because we are testing, I don't know, for example, measures to counter online gambling. And you know, so I need to make sure that those online panels are reliable, but there is no straightforward way to do that. So again, that's another problem of digital research, which is, you know, not often spoken openly. And the fact that, you know, it makes the fact that even a traditional methods transposed on the digital actually creates new methodological issues, which are still in a way interpretable with the same principles, but the solutions are still have to be designed. And I think that's a common problem with a lot of digital methods. Think about the sort of rise of asynchronous methods in terms of, for example, qualitative methods, you know, chat interview, chat group, email interviews, and so on. We really don't have a sort of canon of methodology for those because they didn't exist before. And so we found ourselves in a situation where there is a serious lack of standards for good quality. That was my timer for the 45 minutes. So I think, you know, this sort of discussion I'm trying to sketch today applies to different aspects, and so I want to conclude just with this point of the native methods, and then you know, hopefully we can have a chat about it. So far, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, I'm talking about sort of trying to use the same canon of methodology that were existing before to the sort of digital version of some of these, most of the methods that's in social sciences we use. But there is a sort of school of thought, if you will, that instead thinks that these methods are simply not good enough, so to speak, and also the sort of methodological principles that we would apply. And the idea here is that, no, we have to look at sort of native digital methods, which are specifically built for the sort of digital data that we have. And now, I don't have the time to sort of describe some example. Well, perhaps one, yes. One example of these digital methods is the sort of the so-called cross-spherical research that Richard Rogers proposes about using search engines as a way to collect data, in a way exploiting, okay, the algorithm of Google in order to understand the relative popularity of certain, let's say, associated topics to the topic that we are researching. So what we have here is that so a situation where, sure, these are again perhaps innovation in the way how we collect data and the nature of the data, but we have a problem again in assessing the sort of methodological aspects from, for example, in this case, what is the construct validity of using search engines ranking as a measure of, say, general attitudes or popularity of a topic in a country. So I think while it is true that we are still waiting for native methods for the digital world, I think some of these principles still remain valid unless we develop a different sort of conceptual toolbox of methodological principles that applies to these new methods. And so there are still open issues that they are, so there's this issue of the canon, the issue of sampling I mentioned before, and quasi-population, but there's also a lot of food for thought about the assumption of many of the analytical methods that we're using. So, for example, the assumption of text mining about the text, the human-produced text. Some more technical stuff about how errors are considered in machine learning, the issue of variable selection and model selection in the way how basically we develop statistical models. This is, I wrote a little paper on that. So the issue here is a broader discussion between sort of the old and the new, if you will, but with an emphasis on the fact that perhaps some canons of the old are still valid, and that definitely are valid to me. But at the moment, there isn't that much discussion as I thought about this. I will stop here. Here there are some references. I suppose the organizers then will share the slides. So there are some references about papers mentioned in the slides, and so a long list. And here there's some contacts in case you just want to drop some. So I'll stop sharing. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then here we go. I will. Here we go.
That's great. Thanks so much, Giuseppe. That's so interesting and really wide-ranging cover of issues for us all to talk about. So if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A chat and we can talk through those. But while everyone's having a little bit of time to think about their questions and put them into the chat, I'd like to ask a few because there's lots of things I'd like to ask. I think you've really hit on a really difficult challenge in the sense of really trying to figure out how we can use our existing ways and principles of methodology in the kind of digital domain. And I was thinking while you were talking, for me personally, I think very much that we can use our understandings and approaches of traditional methods, if you like, and apply them to all sorts of different kinds of digital data and digital approaches. But there are moments when, like you say, they just don't work anymore. And thinking about the whole range of different things you spoke about, you talked about surveys, but all the way up to kind of much more kind of big data approaches and using data mining techniques and so on. Is there for you a straightforward dichotomy between the old and the new, or do you think that's just too difficult to achieve?
That's a very good question. I think it's difficult to have this kind of straightforward old and new division because let's take the example of the survey, okay, which is probably the pillar of social scientific research for good or bad. In fact, online surveys have become a much more complex object to analyze compared to traditional surveys. The example I make in the book and I usually do in my classes, the addition of metadata and paradata that you can collect during your survey. And in fact, the surveys now have become or could become a sort of hybrid entity in which you can embed sort of experimental elements into it. So there is clearly a very interesting evolution, but I would say that in that case, I mean, I've done myself, survey / experiments. My sort of canon still remains traditional in the sense that I still, look at the sort of issue of validity, also internal validity, external validity. So I sort of still refer to those, perhaps for the lack of any other sort of principle I can rely on. And in fact, as I think David mentioned, that I am writing a book on online experiments and sort of putting there my experience in doing those, where there are all sorts of new challenges that comes available, as much as opportunities, of course, when you use these methods. But what I found is that there are areas where it's really difficult to find a match between these two. I mean, between the old and the new. When you combine sort of behavioral and self-reported data from social media platform, I think that's where you encounter a lot of difficulties, because that's my impression. With the exception of experiments, a lot of this sort of methodological principle we had and methods we had in the social sciences, they didn't really rely on behavioral measures, but on self-reported measures. And so we had this sort of mismatch between. So, for example, the construct validity issue is sort of meant for self-reported measures in a way. And so for behavioral measures, the mix of two, it becomes an interesting situation there. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.
Yes, no, I think it speaks a lot to the sorts of challenges I have and think about. That's great. I think following on to that and probably just building on that a little bit more, one of the questions from the audience is from Sarah, and she says, can you talk a bit more about how old methods that you've used in your research that worked well in the digital space? So just to reflect maybe a little bit more on that.
Sure. Well, I found, for example, that, well, let's give two sort of brief examples. That in general, in the case of experiments, all the sort of safety procedure that you, safety for let's say for the safe quality that you employ in experiments tend to be true also for online experiments. But also in the qualitative domain, what I found is that really the experience of running focus groups on face-to-face, okay, turn out to be extremely precious also for the online version of it. Because of course, they're not the same. There are slightly different, sort of challenges in running an online focus groups compared to, and in these months where people could not, run focus groups face-to-face, a lot of people sort of, had to do online interviews or focus groups for qualitative research. And I found also in that case, the main, let's say, guidelines, methodological guidelines about focus groups turn out to be still valid. However, the distinction there is that as soon as you have a focus groups that is synchronous, so in real time, that works well as a face-to-face. But if you try a focus group that is asynchronous, then you are in a new domain, because all the concerns you had, about avoid polarization, sort of mediating the interventions of people and so on, becomes something else when you do in an asynchronous way. Then to the point that, maybe we shouldn't call it focus group when it's asynchronous, maybe it's something else, even the terminology, we still use the traditional terminology, and then perhaps that might be misleading.
Yeah, it's interesting. At what point do we make that crossover, isn't it? And this sort of carries on the kind of qualitative theme. This is a great question about participant observation in the digital realm. How would you define that? How do you think about that? And where would you place things like content analysis and sentiment analysis, particularly when thinking about using social media pages and groups? And how can we construct or argue using construct validity while using those kinds of methods? So thinking content analysis, sentiment analysis, and so on. So quite a complex question, but it kind of builds on what you were just saying, I think.
Okay, on qualitative research, I think, I think my impression is, and I've spoken with people, they wrote some of the classic handbooks of qualitative research, for example, Uwe Fleck, I don't know if you know him, and I remember when I was doing my PhD at the LAC, one of the sort of books for training yourself in qualitative research was by him, and we met in a conference before the pandemic, and he basically mentioned this fact that there is the need of rediscussing some of the standards of and guidelines in qualitative research in the context of online, because some of the aspects concerning not only the way how we collect data, but also how we analyze data. Okay. Now, content analysis and sentiment analysis. Let's say for content analysis, I think the issue here is that if it's a content analysis that it's similar to the traditional content analysis, so to speak, in the sense that the coding is done by humans, okay? I think the sort of guidelines of traditional content analysis still applies. However, when we do apply text mining, then it's a different story, because what you find is that different methods in text mining have very strong assumption about text, okay, the nature of text they're analyzing. And again, if your purpose is descriptive, perhaps that doesn't matter that much. But as you try to sort of understand, for example, what people think about whatever issue based on text they've produced and you analyzed through text mining, then it becomes problematic because of the use of words and a number of the way how, I mean, we go then into technical stuff, but simply the moment in which you use, for example, topic modeling, which strips the text out of any sort of semantic relationship and becomes a bag of words, then has all sort of assumption about what the text becomes, and then you should be able to say, well, it doesn't matter if it's a fully normal phrased text or a bag of words to indicate people's opinion. That's a, you should justify that kind of assumption. Now, sentiment analysis, I think it's even more problematic for one reason, is because it started as a sort of practical application, if you want, of certain techniques. But what I think is lacking is a connection with serious and, in a way, empirical proven theories about human emotions. I'll give you an example. So the most basic sentiment analysis is able to recognize is whatever text or sentence is positive or negative about whatever topic. Okay, of course now there's more nuanced way of doing it, but that's the sort of issue. Now, in sort of cognitive sciences, there's a sort of new generation, if you want, of theories about emotions that says, well, what you should really look at is something called the cognitive appraisal of information. So negative emotions can have, depending on what type of negative emotion is, hate or sadness or so on, can have very different cognitive outcomes, okay? So the positive negative distinction basically doesn't really matter. And so when we are dealing with a situation like in the commercial sector, where you just want to know if a product has received some positive or negative, reception, fine. But when you're using that, for example, as a substitution to sort of take the pulse of or the mood of a country, well, then I think you have to be very, very careful, because that sentiment analysis, again, has a massive problem of construct validity, because you just don't know what is measuring. Is measuring something perhaps related to emotion, but it's very hard to tell what is measuring. And if you look at some comparative studies where they basically look at the sort of classification sentiment analysis does with and people self-classify those tags, you can find some very interesting differences. But also, I mean, the differences are in the consequences of those emotions, because you assume, for example, that being negative means something, means opposing something. That might not be the case. So I think sentiment analysis, had a lot of hype, and because I mean I've used it, so I'm the first to be guilty. I mean when it came out, but then you realize that as you go into the issue of trying to understand better in more details what it does, then there are a lot of issues there.
I wonder if this also picks up, I'm sorry, I'm going to butt in with another question, but I also wonder if that picks up a kind of tension that I've seen in my area, which is sociology of education, is particularly around kind of academic practices and academics trying to use data science and the move to social data science, and the commercial sector, and the kind of different kind of assumptions, motivations, and all those kinds of things of these different groups. And I sometimes wonder, as a traditional social scientist myself, whether to really kind of have a more positive engagement with all of these methods and ways of thinking about producing guidance and so on for researchers in the future, is to really kind of try and disentangle, if at all possible, the commercial sector from other data science work going on in universities, because I feel sometimes there's more interest in both prediction and explanation, for example, within a computer science team or a social data science team than there is if you went to someone trying to sell a product in a shop, or a simple example. So I think that's a really challenging time for digital methods in academia to try and pull apart these kind of commercial pressures, or if it's even possible to pull those apart from the kind of understanding what people are doing with this data and trying to sort the good from the bad, if we can even do that.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree. I mean, I personally see the role of social scientists as very, very important at this stage, because on one end, you want to engage with data scientists, computer scientists. You want to share your experience, your expertise in doing research. I mean, I do that in my university. I used to do it in the UK as well. It takes time, it takes some effort to sort of develop a common language, understanding, and so on. But in academia, we have usually the space to do that, and that's a crucial point, because otherwise, if we don't do it, my experience is that because there is a need of understanding social phenomenon through, and there is also this idea that because now we got the data, we can understand everything, so to speak. They will do it. They will do it, without the social scientists, so to speak. And the results sometimes are fairly questionable in what they can find. But I mean, that's normal. I mean, it would be the same if I tried to do something in data science. I mean, and so fair enough. The point there is that a dialogue is important. With the commercial sector, what I found is that the sort of the rhythm of the sort of the expectations of delivery of research and what you do is simply not really compatible with academia. to me, the crucial sort of actor to engage with is government. Why government and, let's say, public institutions? Because they are starting to use these data to evaluate policies, to sort of take to develop policy as well. And that's where most of my experience is, that to do sort of research that will become the background to policy. And in that case, and because now we used to do it with traditional methods, now we are extending it to digital. And in that case, I have to be sure that whatever I do is as good as possible, because I know that that becomes the base for policy. And when it becomes the base for policy, basically you have to, it can have consequences if you get something very sloppy. So I think that's the area where we can contribute, because also there's more time to develop things. There is more, and not all of them, but some policymakers are aware of the fact that it's better, it's better to get it right and wait a bit more rather than the opposite. Although not everyone is like that, of course.
That's great, thank you. So going back to the questions that we've got in the Q&A, we've got one kind of clarification question, but I think it also really nicely links to thinking about kind of explanation versus prediction and so on. So it's a question that's asking particularly about slide 6, and Davina is asking, may we say that model A is when we are conducting an exploratory study and model B is when we're creating a testable framework? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, that's the typical mistake. Do you want me to share the slide? It perhaps might help the explanation. Okay, I'll just put it on there. Okay, now it should be. Let me put it full screen. So, well, the way I sort of explain this slide is that A is the condition of the typical condition of a researcher that has the possibility of designing from scratch the instruments to collect data about whatever topic you're studying. Okay, so the idea is that you start from a concept. The concept can come from theory, from your intuition, whatever. And then you move through different sort of levels of making this concept operationable so that you can collect. And so it's well, here is portrayed as linear. It could be slightly non-linear, but essentially the idea is you move from something normally abstract, the concept, to something very concrete, the variables you have to measure. Okay. In the case of B is the case where typical of repurposing data that somebody else has collected, where you have variables, okay, and you want to relate this variable to whatever concept. So, for example, I was mentioning the issue of political participation. Okay, now in the case of B means that I go on Twitter and I use the available variables there, for example, retweets or likes on tweet, as a measure of political participation if these retweets and likes are about political content, or they are about let's say related to a political actor and so on. So I'm adapting what I have available from the data that I'm using to my concept. And then, of course, the problem here is that if I do that, if I say, okay, if someone puts a like on a tweet or retweeted, that's a political participation. Okay, that's a formal political participation that doesn't cover the complexity of the concept of political participation. Now, if I'm very honest and very straightforward, and I say, well, look, this is not political participation per se. This is sort of political participation in the environment of Twitter, okay? then perhaps I run less the risk of making this selection of variable available related to a construct that in fact could be measured in a much more complex way and tackling different measures. Now, we know from existing studies and political participation has different aspects, let's say. So we should be aware of the fact that if we use the available variables based on Twitter potential data, we lack certain domains of political participation, certain dimensions of political participation. So the idea here is that we are essentially simplifying constructs based on the variables we have, okay? So I see that as two modalities of related empirical research to the theoretical construct. Case A is you start from the theoretical construct and you move to the empirical. Case B is you got some empirical data that somebody else has collected, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, and you try to repurpose this empirical data into a theoretical construct. Okay, so that's the sort of, I hope that was clear enough. I'll stop sharing my screen.
That's great, thank you. And another question, as well as saying thank you very much for the excellent talk, is to say, one of the things that we explore in human psychology is what can be attributed to explicit versus implicit mechanisms. And I think you touched on this earlier. So many of these indicators can be easily analysed through design data. Is there any investigation about how to explore implicit mechanisms regarding people's online behaviours via native digital methods?
That's a very good point, because, well, to make it short, yes, there are. The point I think here is that my personal point of view, I mean, is that any research methods has an underlying model. I mean, methods related to human people, I mean, to humans, let's say, has a sort of sometimes explicit, sometimes it's not explicit, but has a model of human decision-making, behavior, and so on. Okay, so if you have a dual model, as mentioned by this question, so that you have implicit and explicit, let's say, components of cognition, and they play an important role. We know, I mean, there's some Nobel Prizes won by Kahneman and Tversky, or System 1, System 2, and so on. In fact, in the first part of the book, what I did, I map this model with methods, okay? Because in fact, some of the research I've done is related to this, let's say, behavioral research. But the point there is that, yes, digital methods have a lot of behavioral measures, and some of these behavioral measures are implicit. I mean, can allow implicit measurements. And in fact, this is what some of the platforms do. I mean, they do use behavioral measures as implicit indicators. The classical example I make during classrooms, during my classes in the classroom is Facebook tracking the amount of time you spend on pictures. And so if you spend more time on pictures of cats than dogs, the sort of implicit assumption they make is that you like more cats than dogs. So these are however, as far as I can tell, you have these sort of single indicators you can draw, but not a kind of systematized way of doing it. So for example, in surveys or online experiments, you have, has been criticized, but still exists, the implicit association test you can use, and some others. For the digital, I mean, again, the transposition of that into the digital is still an issue. I mean, I've done online experiments where I try to, let's say, collect implicit attitudes, okay? But at the end of the day, what I was doing was some kind of form of implicit association test, or some kind of form of still survey type of data collection, okay? Well, I do use also quite a lot discrete choice experiments. So these are also, I think, they allow implicit preferences. But again, we go into kind of more technical stuff. But yes, there are. Although they are not systematized. Not, I wouldn't say that. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. And I know Peaks from the convening OxDEG team would like to ask one before we hand over to David.
Hi, you'll have to forgive me for being a bit obtuse, and I haven't quite formulated this question completely in my mind. But I guess I'm coming from a very most of my training is quantitative and computational, but in doing social science work, I've actually found that just from my own experience, I learn much more from doing more kind of qualitative work, and that the kind of standards of rigor that are in place for whether it's replicability or the types of validity that you're talking about seem to me, and maybe I'm just shooting from the hip here, but seem to me to be like kind of I don't know, like from coming from a place of this like physics envy or something, or just or like or so responsive to other trade-offs like ecological validity trade-offs, for example. And so I'm just thinking about how, or I guess I wonder how you think about like the particular methods for particular problems, or what types of knowledge different kinds of methods can produce, and how you think about that kind of selection of methods.
Yeah, I think, you know, the challenge I found myself is that I have to say, when I can, always include a component of qualitative research in the research I do. I'm coming from a sort of tradition where I see the two sort of the two type of methodologies as complementary. So we always, when we have the resources and the time, we try to do that. And what I found interesting is that in some recent studies we've done about essentially online experiments about decision making, how people choose between, let's say, some well, not super exciting issues, but let's say like pension schemes. This is was a study for the European Commission. What I found is that there is a lot of work of testing that we have to do in terms to make both in terms of internal and external validity, make and also ecological validity, make these online experiments as sort of realistic as possible, and not one big issue is the sort of cognitive sort of tax that this type of data collection produce. This is an issue, for example, that you know, the sort of cognitive scarcity induced by online data collection. Here, I mean data collection that implies a sort of reactivity from participants, is also something that is a bit unexplored, in the sense that for those who have done online surveys, they know that if you do an online service that lasts more than 20-25 minutes, creates a lot of quality issues in your data. So I think you're right in pointing out that in a way it's difficult to canonize, because you do have to adapt methods with the team you have, I mean the topic of research and the context of data collection. The context that could be not only, let's say, the platform you use, so to speak, but even, I mean, the context of usage more in general, or in a given time. I'll give you an example. I mean, if you try to do now online data collection in the period where, you know, a lot of people are smart working, and to find half an hour or an hour to do, you know, without distractions in their home to do whatever task you give them, well, good luck with that. I mean, it's very difficult, also because there is an endogeneity problem there, because people who belongs to these online panels tend to be the same people that do smart working. And so you have this additional problem there. So I think, you know, you do have, on one hand, this need of some basic sort of canonized guidelines to ensure a level of quality, but at the same time, it is a very fluid, moving target. And in fact, when I was writing the digital methods book, I thought maybe this book, you know, in 1 year or 2 years, it will be obsolete, or there'll be, you know, something wrong with it, because it is a fast-moving target. What you're trying to describe. I found that perhaps, yes, there are some aspects that are still, I don't know, there was a section on text mining where I described some techniques, and now new techniques are better for a number of reasons. But I found that some of the discussion about the methodological aspects, I think they're still there. Mostly they're still there. And what I mean, that book in my case just prompted me to think more, and then perhaps write different things specific to some of the topics, the issues that I raised there. And so in a way, it was a starting point rather than anything else.
Okay, thank you so much. We could talk a lot more, particularly I would want to talk more about these final issues, about how qualitative and quantitative methods, which have been in tension for decades, remain in interesting tensions, and actually an awful lot of those very old discussions are still completely valid. And it's those conceptual issues rather than the detailed technical questions which really are perplexing, and those ones do not date in the way that the technical question, which is just what you were saying. We haven't got time to go into those now, but we should flag them very strongly. And as well as thanking you so much for this talk, which has raised these important issues, I will remind everyone that in 2 weeks' time, we have a deeply qualitative paper about video production in digital video production in Pakistan. So whole other set of issues. But for now, we can conceptually give Giuseppe a big round of applause. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.